Welcome to our webinar on ammonia project features. And today we will talk about renewable fertilizers in Europe. Today I will be joined by Birgitte Holter, who is the head of Yara Green and Low carbon fertilizer solutions at Yara, and by Theo Paquet, who is the regulatory and Green Ammonia Officer at Fertilizers Europe. So this webinar will take approximately 1 hour, and the session will be recorded, and afterwards you can find the recording on YouTube. Next slide, please. So to put a little bit in perspective what's happening right now in Europe, as you all might know, there's a little bit of a crunch of natural gas within Europe. And due to that, the prices of natural gas have risen quite a lot in Europe, and most of the ammonia producers in Europe, among which Yara is the biggest ammonia producer in Europe, most of the ammonia producers have had to curtail at least part of their capacity due to the very high natural gas prices, making it uncompetitive to produce ammonia in Europe. However, that's one side of the story, because on this side of the story, natural gas prices are very high, making it very hard to make fossil-based ammonia. But if we go to the next slide, there are also opportunities arising. Because if you look at the cost gap between fossil-based ammonia and renewable ammonia, that gap was still quite large when looking at the past few years. However, given the high natural gas prices in Europe, it might actually be competitive soon and sooner than we expected to produce renewable ammonia within Europe. So one of the announcements of this year was between Yara and Landmannen that there will be renewable fertilizers, so fossil-free fertilizers, starting from 2023 in Sweden. So this was already an early announcement, and given the current situation with the high natural gas prices, we might actually expect this trend to accelerate. And in today's webinar, we actually want to dive into what are kind of the dynamics that are at play, both on the technological side, but also on the regulatory side, that make this kind of developments happen. So I'm very, very pleased to have Birgitte Holter and Theo Paquet with me to briefly introduce these topics and then go into a discussion with them. So with that, I would actually like to give the floor to Birgitte Holter.
Thank you so much, and I hope you can hear me and that you can also show my little slideshow. Thank you so much. So, yeah, I'm heading the green and low carbon fertilizer in Yara, and that means that I'm there to help the salespeople finding opportunities for green and low carbon fertilizers and putting everything in order so that we as Yara are able to go to the market with those solutions. So I'm not a technician, so I'm not part with this Yara Clean Ammonia, who is actually building up the capability to produce. However, I'm on the market side, and therefore there is also questions today that I will not answer because there could be too business related. But let's go from there to the first one. And you say, yes, we have a background today with kind of these extreme price and different hikes and the lack of availability of fossil fuel. But really, we started this long before. We started this many years ago, because we are already now in the construction phase. So our starting point was really based on our mission, where we say responsibly feed the world and protect the planet, knowing that we cannot feed the world without producing mineral fertilizer in addition to all organic fertilizer, but there is also a need for mineral fertilizer in the future. And if we're going to do that while protecting the planet, we had to review our own production process, as well as helping farmers to reduce the emissions at farm. But basically look at ourselves first, and then we can help farmers. Next one is basically for those of you who do not know us, we are a company with 17,000 employees. Basically what we call a crop nutrition company. However, with our green ammonia, we might also go to other markets such as maritime and energy. We are 105, 6, 7, 8 years, 15 actually, 1905 company. And we are also the biggest trader in ammonia. So, and that is also a little bit on the sideline of my competence, but I'll answer as much as we can. Totally global and a big fertilizer producer. Next. And then when we look into the ammonia market as such, and also looking into how the green ammonia will develop, there are these three drivers. As I said, it's the agricultural sector, and most of the ammonia today goes to the fertilizer sector, and in some industrial uses, that's the orange part of this. And then what we see when we come with a low carbon and green ammonia, we will be able to also convert some of the shipping industry and help the shipping industry, the maritime industry, to reduce their footprint, and also to use for power generation and possibly other hydrogen carriers. So it's really where we see that the green is not only that we can reduce the carbon footprint of the food, as is our prime mission, but with the green ammonia, we are opening up a totally new market for ammonia as well. Next one. So again, back to why do we as a fertilizer company look and think we play a role in the global emission reductions in the food? First of all, why would we do it? But what we're saying is that food, this is made by Boston Consulting and World Economic Forum. The food industry itself, or the food chain, all the food we eat, represent 25% of global emissions. So there is no way, if we are going to reach the Paris Agreement for the globe, that we can avoid looking upon how to reduce in the food chain. So this is our motivation, is that yes, the world will need food, more food in the future. We can participate to reducing that carbon footprint. Now, that's a huge figure and a huge task, of course, and you can discuss now. We're only talking about green fertilizer or green ammonia. What can that do to it? But if you take a snapshot more on a crop point of view on the next slide, and that's the slide that actually made Landman and we work together. It's made by Landman. You can find it on Landman's website. But where they started to look into the steps that makes up a wheat flour, which they have their own wheat flour brand in the shops in Sweden. And when they went through and looked at where do the emissions come from, you would see that in the middle part, you see it's the emissions from farm, and that's almost 60%. But before farm, even before farm, there is a 33% emission comes from actually the input factors to farm, which is basically then fertilizer. So if we can make green fertilizer, we can slash off in one stroke 30% of the footprint of a wheat flour in the shops, and then it starts to make sense. Then we start to really make a difference. And that is what Landman also has said, is that one thing is that we can slash off the carbon footprint, but we can also then look upon when we take out, they have worked with their farmers to take out all the fossil part in all the parts of the chain, in all using biodiesel and using green energy, that we can actually take out all the fossil input into a potential food chain. So if you look upon that, of course, the next question is who will pay it? And let me start in another end, because before we come to who will pay. But really, if you look upon the Nestlé, the PepsiCos, and the Danones of the world, more than 200 food companies have pledged science-based targets. And when you pledge a science-based target, you also need to reduce your upstream emissions, which is, for practical purposes for the food chain, to a large extent what is happening in the agricultural sector. So we expect there to be a more and more drive from the food industry, because nowadays they will take the low-hanging fruits, they will cut what they can do internally at the lower prices, but at one point they will actually need the help from the agricultural industry. And then as we just saw, we can, in the orange part there, we can actually make a big difference in certain products, not in all, but where we can really help, we can help. And then when you transfer that cost into what does it mean for the consumer, and I would underline, it's not given that it is the consumer that should pay it. There can be other ways of financing a green transition as well, such as getting for the companies to have low loans, low interest rates on their loans, to have the share value, etc. But if it was to be transferred, you can say it's not sort of unbearable cost that has to be transferred over to the consumer here. So it should be possible to together make a transition, a green transition. And 2 more slides only, and I'll shut up. What is sort of the value proposition, if you want, of a green fertilizer, a carbon-free fertilizer? First of all, it is impactful. It takes off, as we just saw, it takes off a major portion in one go, the carbon footprint of selected foods. It is a real carbon reduction, so it's nothing like you have to compensate for or anything. So it's high on the top mitigation hierarchy there, so it's impactful in that sense as well. It's fossil-free. Of course, there is an asterisk. There are reminiscences, both of carbon and fossil in this chain, but it's sort of close to fossil-free, which at the time when we made it was basically a proof that we are now moving into the non-renewable economy, and that we're ready, we're starting really the transition into a world which is fossil-free. Today, of course, everybody will think more about food security, about energy security, about being autonomous. So that has come to after we have started. And then it's effortless basically for the industry because we have done it. So it's no changes for the farmers because it's the same product, it's made in a different way, and therefore basically no changes to the logistical chain either. Going to the left-hand side, what it is sort of concretely is that these we are talking about are nitrate-based fertilizer, because that is where we can make it carbon-free. It's produced already in a plant with catalyst technology in the nitrate step. If not, it wouldn't be, of course, carbon-free or N2O-free. And then it's based, and in addition, on the green ammonia, which is, in my opinion, basically ammonia based on made from water and air. Next one, and then back to, and I hope here Theo will continue and take, because of course it's, we need also, or that it would be even better when we have a really also regulatory support here that would intensify. Of course, today we know that we don't need that kind of economic incentivation if those gray prices stay at the place where it is, but none of us hope or even believe, and definitely all of us fear that it should be there. There's normal that the green transition will cost somewhere. So a regulatory environment would, of course, be extremely important. We do see a pull from the market, so that is both from the marine market and from the food part. The technology is basically there. So again, of course, to scale it up, get the cost down, yes, that will happen. And then, of course, the big question is the infrastructure to really have enough renewable energy, and then we're probably back to regulatory as well. So those two combines together there. And that is the introduction that I wanted to see from the Yara side, but we really believe in what we are doing here. We are going to feed the world, and we are going to protect our planet altogether. It would have demanded a green transition regardless of gas prices.
Thank you so much, Birgitte. That was very enlightening to see what Yara is doing to actually get renewable fertilizers, or fossil-free fertilizers you would like to call them. And now I would actually like to move over to Theo Paquet to show us what in general is being done in Europe to decarbonize fertilizer production.
Thank you very much, Kevin. No, so as Birgitte said, there is business opportunity, but that's not necessarily sufficient. And in the EU, there is a big drive from the policy side of things to push towards a hydrogen economy. which is what I will be doing. No, maybe go back. No, that's fine. Which I'll be talking about today. So giving a bit of a regulatory, let's say, overview in Europe on low carbon fertilizer, but low carbon fertilizer, what it means, at least at the moment, when it comes to the big climate policy, it basically means renewable hydrogen. So renewable ammonia, renewable hydrogen. That's, let's say, the big fish in terms of policy when it comes to low carbon fertilizers. So a bit about myself and my organization. So I work for Fertilizers Europe, and we represent about 75 to 80% of the fertilizer industry in Europe. And this means about 90% of ammonia production in Europe. So quite a lot of, let's say, interests in this topic. And today I'll be looking at, let's say, policy from 2 points of view. I'll try to make it short. The first one is, let's say, policy drivers. So policies being developed that are actually pushing the industry to decarbonize. Not that we need to, because there is obviously some business cases, but there is quite a strong push, at least at the EU level, towards decarbonizing the industry. And secondly, at regulatory enablers. So what rules do we need to be able to produce those low carbon fertilizer or low carbon ammonia? Can you, yeah, next one. And just as a brief reminder, because I know this is an international audience, in the EU, it's in the law now that by 2050, we have to reach climate neutrality. And this means by 2030, we need to have a 55% reduction in emissions compared to 2005. So this has led to quite a lot of policy and the most ambitious climate legislative package ever, the EU Green Deal, which has a lot of influence on our sector and will have a lot of influence on our sector going forward. Can you, yeah, next one, please. So regulatory drivers, you can go to the next one as well. So first thing, just to set the scene and what's been going on so far. So for the last decade, there's been a carbon market in Europe, one of the first to be introduced, which has been successful. And for the fertilizer sector in specific, there's 2 processes which are included in this carbon market, where you have to pay for the emissions you produce, and that's the ammonia production and the nitric acid production. And it's been quite successful in one case. In the other one, it's been successful, but not necessarily to the extent that we need. So if you go to the next slide, please. So as you can see here, this is from Fertilizers Europe, for nitric acid, actually, Europe is very far in the lead. And this is in large part, we can say, was driven by the introduction of the ETS, so the carbon market mechanism in Europe. However, for ammonia, we are reaching the technical limits of the process. And because it is, let's say, a market-based mechanism, it's very much focused on what we can say incremental technological gains, so improving step by step in terms of energy efficiency, for example. And we are very much nearing the limits of what energy efficiency we can do with steam methane reforming. And therefore, we need a paradigm shift. And as Birgitte said, and as all of you are aware, in the case of Europe, this is very much a focus, and it's electrolysis derived hydrogen that you can use to produce ammonia. Of course, there are other technologies like carbon capture and storage, but let's say the one that's most popular for policymakers across most of Europe, and at least in Brussels, so the European Commission and the other institution, is what we call renewable ammonia. So from hydrogen derived from electrolysis. Next slide, please. So I was talking about a paradigm shift, and this brings us to renewable hydrogen. So quite early when they started developing the Green Deal, the Commission realized that, yes, the workhorse would be let's say the driving force would be the renewable energy capacity in Europe, but there needed to be, let's say, in between sources of energy for chemical sector, storing energy, transporting energy. And they quite quickly settled on hydrogen, which does have some of its issues that we know of. But they looked at hydrogen as one of the Swiss Army knives that could do a lot of things and really help further along the decarbonization of society. And as we are mostly aware, and most of us in the ammonia sector, for us, the real workhorse of this hydrogen economy will be ammonia, whether it's for transporting hydrogen long distance or storing energy as ammonia, or through chemical processes like the production of fertilizers. In 2021, the Commission developed, let's say, a hydrogen strategy. So it's not a legislative package. It's not anything in law, but it was a strategy where they aim to have 10 million tons of renewable hydrogen in the EU and used in the EU, which comes from 40 gigawatts of renewable hydrogen electrolyzers. So that was their target. And how they put their target into practice was through revising what is called the Renewable Energy Directive. So this is a directive that historically is looking at, let's say, increasing the renewable energy we produce in Europe. So it's very much targets on member states so that they increase their renewable energy capacity. And what they did is they extended it to include renewable hydrogen and renewable fuels of non-biological origin. So they call them RFNBOs, which basically includes everything from renewable ammonia, renewable hydrogen, and e-methanol, for example. And one of the big things here, apart from the, let's say, extending the certification scheme for renewable fuels to hydrogen, was that they set a target on industry. And this is, let's say, the biggest thing that came out of this package for us, is that they have set a target for half of our production. This is still being negotiated, by the way, for half of our production to be done using renewable hydrogen. So that's the industry as a whole. But if you look at our consumption, we are, as a European sector, usually use about, we usually say around produce and use around 3 million tons of hydrogen for ammonia production per year. And as in Europe, we are about at 10 million tons of hydrogen being used. We are a sector that uses a third. And the other big sector is the refinery sectors. But part of their production falls under the other target you have on the left, which is for transport. So you could really say that we are the sector that's being targeted the most. And this is a this will be, because it's not finalized yet, this will be another big driver, which should hopefully also help in terms of investments. And next slide, please. And if this was not ambitious enough, following the invasion of Ukraine earlier this year, the Commission has developed an even more ambitious climate, well, it's not a climate proposal, but it's a proposal to wean ourselves of Russian fossil fuels, which is called Repower EU. And here they have doubled, actually, their hydrogen target, because they see we need to diversify, of course, the gas that we import, but they see a big solution as replacing the gas that we're using today by hydrogen, and by renewable hydrogen specifically. And what this means for us is that the aim now is to import 10 million tons of hydrogen and to produce 10 million tons in Europe. And actually 4 million tons of this renewable hydrogen should be imported, should be imported as ammonia. So quite significant volumes. And if you look at the black box on the graph, and as a reminder, this is just a plan, no legal basis so far. But in the Fit for 55, so this was the Renewable Energy Directive I was talking before, which was 50%, they were planning for the petrochemical sector to use about 1.3 million tons of renewable hydrogen in 2030, and now it's gone to 3.2 million. So depends how you look at what petrochemicals means in Europe, but this clearly means that the Commission, at least, has in its mind that we would be able to do above 70–75% of renewable hydrogen by 2030, which is, well, to put mildly, very, very, very ambitious. Extremely ambitious, we could say. Next slide, please. Yeah, so if this has not made it clear, the EU aims to take the lead in the new global hydrogen economy. This is just, let's say, a rough map showing the countries that are, let's say, the front runners. So in blue, you can see the ones that are banking on CCS, so carbon capture and storage, and in green, the ones that are more focused on renewable ammonia. This is very much based on public domain data. And what we found is that there's usually a combination of four factors that make a country one of those front runners. First one clearly is geography. the countries with access to renewable energy will be advantaged. So south of Europe, north of Europe. But geography also based on location. So if you're located near a port, big port, let's say Port of Rotterdam, Port of Antwerp, also a big advantage there. Then clearly political support and funding is imperative. Yes, we are in a crisis at the moment with the gas prices, but this is also a great opportunity because we need to decarbonize, and a lot of funding, of public funding, at least in the EU, is available. Then clearly existing ammonia industry being present, because these are the ones that know how to produce ammonia. These are the ones that will take the lead at the beginning, clearly. And finally, a bit quite interestingly, in Europe, we're talking a lot about hydrogen clusters, because these are the ones that are going to be first connected to, let's say, a hydrogen backbone. And you can see this starting, or at least being quite quickly developed in areas like the Netherlands or Belgium. And in terms of scale, from what we're seeing at the moment and in the next couple of years, we're seeing 10 to 90 megawatt projects with in the mid 2020s reaching 100 to 800 megawatt projects. And hopefully by the end of the decade, we might see coming online gigawatt project, or maybe early 2030s. And then for the last point, if you can, next one as well, regulatory enablers. Yes, so obviously there's voluntary schemes for, we can call it certifying or attaching a document to assure that your production of ammonia is fulfilling a certain set of criteria. So you can do it via a voluntary scheme, which as Fertilizers Europe, and I know that the Ammonia Association is also developing. However, when you want to reach and to contribute to the targets I mentioned above, you need to fulfill strict criteria that are being set by policymakers in Brussels. And one of the key ones is how to make renewable hydrogen or renewable ammonia. And for this, it is in its final stages of development, but some of the key points that we have seen, first, there's a threshold that has been set, and that's about a 70% reduction in emission. It's 3.38 tons of CO2 per ton of hydrogen. That's where you start to qualify, so anything below this. And what are the rules for what electricity you can use? Three main things you should take away. First, geographical correlation. You need to produce your electricity in the same bidding zone that you're using it in. In Europe, bidding zone is how the electricity market functions. It's usually member state level, but in some countries, there's multiple bidding zones in one member state, like Sweden or Italy. Secondly, temporal correlation. You need to produce the electricity at the same time, well, not at the same time, but within a time period before you consume it. At the moment, it's set at 1 hour. So you have 1 hour to consume it from the moment it has been produced. And finally, and that's actually the most important one, is the additionality criteria. And this means that all renewable electricity that you use to produce renewable ammonia or renewable hydrogen must come from new sources. So this means that if I want to build an electrolyzer tomorrow, I will also have to build a new electricity capacity. And the reason for this is that they are afraid that with all the industries jumping on the hydrogen train, it's going to take away a lot of electricity for the electrification of that's already being used for electrification, which they are saying is more efficient. In our case, we believe the additionality criteria will hamper at the beginning the development of the industry, and it needs much more flexibility, at least in the ramp-up phase. But this is obviously still being discussed at European level. And to finalize, what I know I've said a lot, and I don't know what time I have left, but to finalize this, just a quick word, there's also an EU taxonomy, which is basically, let's say, a guideline for financial actors to know what to invest in, what is considered sustainable. And for ammonia, the rule as it stands today is that you need to produce it using hydrogen that produces less than 3 tons of CO2 per ton of hydrogen. So you can see divergences as well that need to be cleaned up in the coming years. And I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Theo. It's very interesting to see kind of two perspectives, because on one hand, I really hear from Birgitte that there is a market push market pull actually to get renewable fertilizers because downstream these companies like Nestle, PepsiCo, Danone, Heineken, etc. they need to decarbonize their value chain, whereas on the other side there's really a regulatory stick approach by the European Union that kind of demands the decarbonization. So I would like to question to Birgitte, how is the market right now regarding the off-takers? Are they willing to pay a premium or anything for zero carbon fertilizers at this moment?
So we will start producing next year, and therefore we go to market, of course, with as close as possible with a market price here. So what is more important here is that Theo also talked about a paradigm shift. I think this is also a paradigm shift in terms of the full supply chain, because what we need is that this is a cooperation, not only to the farmer and that we sell to the farmer and off we go, but that we also ensure together with the farmer that this pull in the food industry also makes it possible for the farmer to be part of it. So that is also the paradigm shift that I can see, is that we will see more and more value chains or supply chains working together, not necessarily competing company by company, but actually which are the value chains that really takes the green to the market first, be it in food or be in other products.
Very clear. So Theo, can you comment on how that is from the regulatory side of things?
No, so first, I really think, and I think it's a great opportunity for the industry, and I think indeed the market is there. Whether it's tomorrow or if it's in 5 or 10 years remains to be seen how fast it goes. The reason there is this regulatory push, even if possibly the market is already there with the gas prices as they are, is that from the policymaker side or the perspective is we don't have time to change. And of course you have front runners and big companies. I mean, the example Birgitte has given, I mean, Yara is one of the world leaders in fertilizers, PepsiCo, Nestle, they're big companies. But you really push everyone. And also you have to remember that the EU is a very, well, varied continent with a lot of different member states, a lot of different companies, different contexts. That's why for them it's very important to give a push to make sure that the industry is going in that direction. And for them, how it was working before, so I was saying with the carbon market, yes, emissions were going down, but they were not going down nearly fast enough to reach any type of goal, whether it's the Paris Accords or the climate neutrality in 2050.
No, that's indeed very clear. And over the past few years, the European fertilizer market, of course, also has kind of saturated because it has optimized the natural gas-based ammonia plants to use as little natural gas as possible to, to make sure that the cost goes down. But of course, you end up with in the end, a paradigm where you cannot, or like an asymptote where you cannot go down unless you change technology. You go from natural gas reforming to either natural gas reforming with some kind of sequestration technology, or you go to renewable fertilizers. So I was actually wondering, because on the nitric acid production side, it seemed that there was really a stick approach where you had to go down. So I was wondering, could you elaborate a little bit more on why that works so well in Europe, Theo?
So, disclaimer, I was not in the industry when it happened, so it's just from what I've understood, talking to colleagues and people from the industry. But I think it was more a question of how, I'm not going to say how easy it was, or how affordable it was, but when you compare it to ammonia energy efficiency, which is a very slow process, here you could really introduce a technology and make a massive change like this. Well, I'm being very simple. So for me, just a simple price signal was sufficient for the industry to just adopt this technology. And it was at this point a relatively weak. Now the carbon price at the moment is almost at 100 euros a ton. I think at the time it was, I imagine it was below 10. And that was already let's say a price signal strong enough because it was a fairly easy to implement technology.
Okay, that's very clear. maybe also from the other side of things, because there are some N2O emissions that can happen at the nitric acid production site, but also downstream when applying fertilizers. The use efficiency of these fertilizers is very key. So maybe Birgitte, you can comment a little bit on how Yara works together with downstream, to make sure that the fertilizer is used as efficiently as possible.
Yes, and back to the catalyst, the technology that was invented by Yara and also is used and by others. It was also because this was N2O, as you say, and we know that it's such a potent GHG gas that I think that was part of the motivation as well. And as you say, perhaps the business cases were not even there for everybody, but everybody thought that this is, as you say, a low-hanging fruit, so let's do it. When it comes to the emissions from field, there, of course, we are working in all kinds of aspects in terms of, first of all, having the 4R rules, that you use the right fertilizer at the right timing, at the right place, not at least in the right volume. So you could even say that, are we reducing our own sales? Yes, we are, because again, we think that is it's better that the fertilizer is used wisely than we over-fertilize and have all the issues related to fertilizers. So that's one part of it. And then comes all the even more sophisticated digital tools, really, which are automated, hanging on the tractors and hanging on equipment, so that you can actually automatically fertilize differently that square meter than you fertilize that square meter, because the soil analysis is already fed into the distributor. So all these kind of things, until you see also the remote sensoring, we are into all those parts as well to really help the world to have a higher yield per acre or per hectare, without, or even rather better, by even promoting biodiversity and making sure that we do not damage the world around us. And why yield is so important? One thing is that it's the farmer income and farmer prosperity, but it's also that land use change is a huge emitter. So the more we can use the agricultural land for what it's for, we can also preserve all the other land for that biodiversity and what the other lands can do. So that's the two aspects of it.
Yeah, and if I can also add on this, there's also, and that's maybe a little bit further in the future, but there's also the aspect of carbon farming and sequestering biomass in the soil. And as Birgitte say, the more biomass you produce with fertilizers, the more the roots and other parts of the plant, of the cereal or whatever it is, will stay in the soil. And it's quite clear that there is a ratio between the carbon you can sequester in the soil and the nitrogen in the soil. So clearly we cannot do carbon farming and carbon sequestration, which we are being asked to do, without nitrogen fertilizers. But clearly it needs to be done in a much more precise and manner. And here you also have inhibitors and a lot of other technologies.
So that's indeed very clear and fair suggestion. And the thing we mainly discuss right now is nitrate-based fertilizers. But when discussing biomass, you could of course also think about another fertilizer. It's not as much used as in Europe as the nitrate-based, but for instance, the urea-based pathways. You can imagine that decarbonizing that not only requires decarbonizing your hydrogen footprint, but also your CO2 footprint. So that becomes a very, very different dynamics, because downstream it might be, for certain soils in Asia, it might be more interesting to use urea, even though upstream you need carbon. So maybe Theo, are there any producers in Europe that struggle with this question?
So I can say a couple of things, but as Yara is the exporting company, I can leave it to Birgitte, I think, who will be better placed. Because I mean, it's true that in Europe, it is clearly dominated by ammonium nitrates. Clearly, urea is being produced, of course, a lot towards technical applications. And we see this continuing as well. in the near future. But when it comes to exports, I think I will let in other parts of the world. I think Birgitte is better placed than me.
No, I just think the answer is short and sweet in the sense we are starting up, and let's start with the easiest part and not to go directly to the most difficult part. So when we have a good performance of green nitrates and we have a good pull in the market, of course, then we take the next step. But let's eat the elephant by pieces and not everything at the same time.
No, I think you're very right. I just wanted to pose the question just to show
it's a fair question, absolutely.
To show how big the question is, because about 55% of the ammonia produced worldwide goes to urea. But I definitely agree with you, Birgitte, that if we can do something easy, we should do it, because that also starts with the electrolyzer capacity, well, more or less easy compared to the urea question. We could start at the electrolyzer capacity, scale it up, because also the numbers that Theo mentions regarding the capacities of hydrogen, renewable hydrogen we would need for ammonia, that's enormous. We probably need to build electrolyzer factories themselves first before we can even do this. The next thing I would actually like to touch upon now is really the regions where we see the renewable ammonia being announced and being developed in Europe. So what you clearly see is Southern Europe, where probably there are some nice solar and wind situations, and in north of Europe, you see that there's existing ammonia capacity on large scale being announced based on hydropower or offshore wind. And so Yara already has some projects in Norway, but also, for instance, in the Netherlands, where part of the ammonia production will be decarbonized. So I was wondering, Birgitte, could you comment a little bit on the context of these locations for renewable ammonia production?
We also have renewable ammonia production in Australia based on solar power. So I guess sort of as you indicate that we need sort of to go through all analysis and evaluations, and there is a lot of green hydrogen and green ammonia projects going on in the world. And not all of them are equally realistic, to put it that way, and not are equally responsible. So I think when we go through area by area, thinking about own projects, looking into other projects, it's all these kind of analyses that we have to do. And there is no easy answer to it. And I also see there's a question about water, for instance. Yes, we must also find places where we also take into consideration that there is enough surface water, that we are not using groundwater, and so there's so many parts going into it, and it's part of why this is not a quick fix as such.
And I mean, I imagine a lot of companies will be trialing different methods, different types of projects, and the winners will start to emerge in the coming years. So I think at the moment there's not just one place. I think, as Birgitte said, is very much clearly the question of renewable energy is the first one, clearly, which is, I mean, it's unfair, but it is the reality of what it's going to look like. Except it also depends how fast the hydrogen backbone develops in Europe. It might democratize it a little bit. In terms of timeline, I think it's by 2025 we should have the beginning, and I think the aim is for a big part of Europe a big part, not all of it, but a big part of Europe, also in the east, to be covered by 2035. So it depends if this is fast enough or not. We will have to see.
No, it's very clear, and you're very right. There are a lot of projects being announced regarding renewable ammonia, some banking on existing markets, some banking on new markets as a shipping fuel and as a hydrogen carrier. I would say that in principle for the nitrate fertilizer, there is an existing product, and as long as kind of the economics make sense compared to fossil-based production, it's kind of an, I would say, easy low-hanging fruit. I was also wondering, Theo, regarding the geography, as I asked Birgitte, how does that kind of what are the kind of different incentives in the north of Europe versus in the south of Europe versus east of Europe? Could you comment a little bit on that? What are kind of the dynamics in terms of production and
I think, yeah. I think the main difference is not necessarily in terms of incentives, it's in terms of existing assets, whether it's the renewable energy capacity or the knowledge on how to build it and the availability, or the existing hydrogen clusters and technology. I think, and also the policies that are pushing this industrial, let's say, hydrogen cluster to exist, rather than, let's say, new policies that are being developed. When it comes to funding, some countries are much faster, and some countries have been announced already much more, let's say, ambitious projects. You look at Germany, they're already they're thinking very much on imports, but they are being much faster, clearly, and vocal about it. But when it comes to EU funding and state aid, the rules are still being developed. And I think we'll have to wait a couple of years to really have a good idea of which member states will be able to provide the most attractive conditions.
Very clear. So keeping on the government side, I would like to get to Birgitte. And so from the role of the government, do you feel there is sufficient incentive from the government to reward first movers on the regulatory or on the monetary level? Or is there still some steps to be made?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I mean, thinking about the agriculture sector, for instance, the input factor to the agricultural sector, like fertilizer, isn't counted in, which is strange, because if you look upon the carbon footprint of food, so this is a little bit how you calculate. If you look upon a company's or a sector's emission, you might sort of put up the borders. Here is the entry of the sector and here is the exit. But if you look upon the product that this sector contributes to, it starts before and it ends after. So by looking upon that, I think you would see that also then you would also get much more the business perspective. So sometimes here also to turn that logic a little bit around could also be something that could help a lot. And to say that that the agriculture industry starts at the farm entry gate definitely takes away a lot of the initiative and the incitament for the farmers, at least, not for the food chain, because they need to think product carbon footprint of the food. So there are, I think there's a lot of, that wouldn't cost anything, by the way, to do that. That is a cost-free thing of mind. Yeah. So there are things to do like that, and of course there is. You can always say there is never enough money, but I think at least now, from a fertilizer point of view, because that's also why we're talking not only ammonia but the fertilizer part here. I think, as we said, sort of, I think the first time we were really mentioned in the newspaper as a sector was April last year. I think the whole situation now has really got a lot of focus on the fertilizer industry, be it, and also the nitrogen fertilizer industry, how important it is for food security. And therefore, I would also think that there will be more attention from the authorities as well to how do we combine these things. So we have a combination of the ammonia and the hydrogen in the future here, and that transition, and at the same time we have the food security, and in a way they meet. So there should be a lot of opportunities here, I think.
You want to comment as well, Theo?
Yeah, just adding, and this is clearly the case and in EU legislation as well, where we're missing the link. You saw, and I talked about the target on renewable hydrogen use. There's no target on, well, whether we want a target or not, but there's no link towards the low carbon fertilizer that will come from this renewable hydrogen, and we are the biggest sectors impacted. So yeah, there is a missing link there for sure. Hopefully, and as Birgitte said, the crisis we're in, at least in Brussels, and I mean, a lot of newspapers now are reporting on the fertilizer crisis, whether it's the Financial Times or everything, which it's a relatively small sector in the big scheme of things, but when it comes to food, it's important, and food is important. So clearly it's gaining attractivity.
Very clear. It's quite interesting to hear about food security as well, and like national food security, because actually it seems a bit like the history is repeating itself. Not entirely, but it rhymes somehow, because 100 years ago, actually, there was a similar situation where countries would really build their own renewable ammonia capacity. because, for instance, in Italy, also in Norway and in Japan, locations where there was no coal, actually renewable ammonia plants based on hydropower were being constructed before the natural gas boom came. And that was for national food security. And right now you see a similar thing. So I was kind of wondering whether on a national level, you've seen any moves in the very recent months to really try to capture local ammonia production for their own needs. Have you seen any recent developments, Theo, or is it
I would say not yet, from what I've seen. And of course, I'm in Brussels, so I'm not as close to the national governments. I can imagine it might change in the near future, but I think it's also important to remember that this also impacts global fertilizer prices. If in Europe we don't have enough, we're going to have to buy it on the global market. But no, to answer your question, no, I haven't had anything that way.
No, very clear, very clear. I was also wondering, Theo, a little bit regarding the eastern side of Europe, just trying to see the dynamics there, because you're not close to the sea. You're not you're not having the best solar resources, and probably also not the best wind resources. So what's kind of the strategy there? Is it trying to bank as Europe work together via a hydrogen grid, or how to decarbonize?
Complicated.
Or is it not, or is it still a big question that we need to?
There's still a big question to be answered. In some countries, there's still space for CCS. That's still something we should not forget. And also, I mean, when you talk Eastern Europe, some of those still have access to the sea or still have access to renewable. But it's true that in some countries, at least at the current stage, that they are aiming for this backbone. But I think I would say let's wait a couple of years until the dust settles on this legislative package before I can provide a good answer here. But just as a reminder of why the fertilizer industry is everywhere, it's exactly as you said, it's food security. Countries want their own fertilizer production. That's why, I mean, in Poland, it's national. It's a national company. So I would find it hard to believe that the governments there won't fight to keep this fertilizer production. But that's my own opinion.
No, very clear. Maybe a few last points before we round off, because we are already getting quite close to the hour mark. A little bit forward-looking, Birgitte, in 5 years from now, when are you happy with regards to the renewable fertilizers in Europe? What's an achievement?
One thing is when I'm happy, and the other one is what is realistic. We talk a lot just sort of because the audience here may not be as aware as some of us are when we talk about the importance of fertilizer for the food security. Just regardless of how much biological fertilizer you add and use manure and other things, if you took away the nitrate-based mineral fertilizer, you would reduce the food production in the world with 50%. So it's that kind of serious figures. That's why we're talking about this. Of course, I wouldn't be happy before everything is on renewable, but I don't think that will happen in 5 years. So, but that, I mean, some people always are afraid of competition, and I think in this case, Yara should not be afraid of competition. I think we should see that there is other people coming up with green solutions as well, that we can get the economy of scale in a few. So perhaps we shouldn't spread too much, but see whether to the degree the cost reductions comes from economy of scale of cost, then we should rather look into scale solutions. However, if the economy of scale is more coming from new technology and can be also on smaller plants, then let's go for that. So therefore, it might need also a cooperation across countries, that not every country needs to have their own fertilizer production, for instance. That is another part of it. Then, as Theo also mentioned, blue is, as we say, not fossil free. So it's not a little bit on the other side here, but for the for the planet for reducing carbon emissions. Blue will also play a role in the short term at least, and there we can also see that outside Europe, where the gas prices are different, that could be also an attractive solution. So no, I would say just say as fast as possible, and something also in this case, then since then fertilizer is so important for our food, it's important that also in the EU we're not talking about hydrogen, the new hydrogen economy, only as an energy backup, but that we also see that hydrogen is used for other vital industries, and that it's not only the energy industry that gets all the focus.
No, very clear, and I think you're totally right. That right now there's a lot of hydrogen with the focus on energy applications, but of course food is like one of the biggest markets where the hydrogen, pure hydrogen, goes right now after refinery. So we should definitely tell the story as well, and they are very much interlinked. Actually, in the history, when you talked about renewable hydrogen with electrolyzers, you basically talked about ammonia. Most of them have shut down, of course, because of the low natural gas prices. But yes, it was always going to ammonia. So that's very clear, and thank you for that. So Theo, in 5 to 10 years from now, what has made you happy?
Legislation is never ending in Brussels, so I'm not sure I'll be happy. No, for me, basically, I want two things. I want clarity in terms of what the rules are in the EU for producing this renewable ammonia. That's number one. I want clarity and something that makes sense, that does not hinder the development of the industry. And secondly, I want funding to go to sectors which can use the hydrogen, but that are vital also to the economy and to, well, in this case, to the survival of people, which is food, because it's not just energy, right? It's also going to be a chemical industry, it's going to be the steel sector, there's going to be a lot of people wanting the hydrogen, right? It's going to be a very scarce commodity. So I would be happy if there's at least some legislation that supports its use in the fertilizer sector.
Very clear, and I think especially that last point also comes back to food security. Yeah, if we use hydrogen for all other things, or we just get the electricity from the grid without the additionality, yeah, where does it go in the end? And I think that's a very important point. So thank you both so much for this very vital discussion and very lively discussion. And actually, the interesting thing is next month we're going to look at how renewable ammonia is actually being produced already. Because next month we will talk with Mark van Doorn from Fertilizers and with Imanol Arrizabalaga Prado from NEL. Yeah, they have worked together on a project at Fertilizers to decarbonize part of an existing ammonia plant. So it's very interesting to see how kind of the framework was set up today, and then next month we will be able to dive into one of the existing projects. So for today, I would really like to thank Birgitte and Theo for their participation. And it was very interesting and very lively, and hope to speak to you soon.
And thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin.